We will start this new webinar by a presentation from the Professor Brice Laurent from Mines ParisTech. He will present us the question of the creation of an urban laboratory for urban experiments. And this webinar is created by the Fondation France-Japon of EHESS. We will try during this year of this webinar to understand the bias by which the experimentators produce urban laboratory and urban experiments in different cities in Europe as well as in Asia and in North America. And we will start by a general presentation. I will let Brice Laurent present himself and his work and continue by his presentation for 45 minutes. You will have the possibility to ask your question in the chat or to ask your question at the end of the presentation of Brice Laurent, and we will answer at your question after this. Thank you. Brice Laurent.
Yes, thanks, Alexandre, for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. So I guess everyone can see my slides. I'm sorry you can't see my face because my webcam doesn't work with the platform we're using, and I'm sorry about that. But hopefully you can hear me clearly. And just to say a few words about myself, I work at the Center for the Sociology of Innovation at Mines ParisTech, and my disciplinary background is mostly in STS, in science and technology studies, and it's the field in which I'm working right now. I'm interested in, broadly speaking, in the relationships between scientific and technological innovation and the ways of organizing democracy. What it means for contemporary democracies to have discussions, debates about science and technology and how to produce and govern them. Well, I've been working over the past few years on topics related to urban experiments, and I'll say a few words about that. But the question I'm interested in today is that of the urban laboratories. And maybe to start the discussion, just something about the current situations, the mere fact that the expression urban lab, urban laboratory has become spread in various settings. So these are illustrations of this. The bottom right corner, it's the Paris, it's the logo of the Paris Urban Lab, and the one on the top right corner is a Polish example, again with the expression urban laboratory. On the bottom left, it's a book cover describing the city as a laboratory, and on the top left, it's another book cover about smart city, and the subtitle is urban laboratory. So these are just random illustrations of the expression urban laboratory, but you can already see that this the word laboratory is promoted as a way of stimulating innovation. It's connected with other concepts such as living labs, such as smart cities. So there are connections with the idea of innovation, technological innovation, the idea also that it's possible to find localized, situated solutions to global problems, and that it's possible to do so in a collaborative way. Of course, these promises have to be problematized, have to be questioned, and that's mostly the objective of my talk today. Also, maybe a word of context about this talk today. Originally, Alexandre asked me to speak about the particular situation of the Olympics, of the cities that are selected to organize the Olympics. And I started thinking about that. I'm not at all a specialist of this particular subfield, but this is actually quite interesting because in the Olympic city, the idea of the lab, the idea of transforming the city into an experimental site is extremely present. So this is an illustration about Tokyo, where, as you can see in this press article, It was, of course, everything has changed now with the crisis, but still, but the idea of the experiment is still on. It's the idea of organizing the world's biggest ever self-driving experiment at the occasion of Tokyo Olympics. And the Olympics is also very interesting because it's almost an exaggerated illustration of what this idea of turning the city into a laboratory entails, because on the one hand, you have celebratory descriptions such as this one, the world's biggest ever self-driving experiment. But on the other hand, you also have lots and lots of illustrations of abandoned sites in Olympic cities. So as I was looking for illustrations, I rapidly came across the example of Athens, and of course the 2004 Olympics then were rapidly described as a missed opportunity, as all these sites were gradually abandoned. And it seems to me that this situation of the Olympic city is, as I said, an exaggerated version of the current fate of cities as they try to turn themselves into global experimental and demonstration sites for the sake of a global public, maybe with questions about how these global demonstrations can be articulated with the needs of the people actually living in the cities. So the questions I want to ask today are the following. So I want to extend the scientific metaphor. When we speak and when people speak of urban laboratories, of course, they refer to the world of science. And in science, the laboratory is expected to represent nature in one way or another. And I think we should use the dual sense of the word representing, asking the scientific and the political questions of representation. What is the kind of truth, the kind of knowledge that is produced, and what is the kind of political representation that is organized in those labs? So we're representing whom and what. The scientific lab is also a space of exception. It's a space like no other. It's a space where different rules apply. It's a space where scientists do things that they couldn't do elsewhere. And I think this is true of the urban laboratory as well. Urban laboratories are in many respects spaces of exception. Spaces of exception because they are exceptional, because they are conceived as sites for demonstrations of new things, of innovation, but also exceptional in the sense that they thrive on regulatory exception. They thrive on, exceptions being carved out of the existing regulatory body. So when we extend this scientific metaphor, when we ask those sort of questions, the broader interrogations that I want to explore today are about the type of political and economic ordering. I mean by political ordering, I mean the kind of political representation, the kind of decision-making process, the kind of, the ways of governing the city that is associated with urban laboratories. And I think the economic dimensions is important as well, because these urban labs are tightly connected to premises of future economic value. They are tightly connected with the inventions of global investors. They are tightly connected with the idea that you need to attract economic actors in the city. And the final question, which is perhaps the most important, is quite simple, actually. It's laboratories for whom? Who benefits from these urban labs? Who are they expected to benefit? And is it possible, and at what conditions, for people, inhabitants of cities, to benefit for this lab? Or maybe we should perhaps rethink what we mean by these labs. Well, I'm asking those questions building on a series of research projects that I've been involved over the past few years about about experiments in cities. These projects have been all collaborative, so all that I'm presenting today is really not my own reflection, but it's the outcome of a collective reflection with colleagues from the Center for the Sociology of Innovation. Well, I've been working with colleagues on various fieldworks in Singapore, in San Francisco, looking at how these cities were experimenting with mobility projects, were experimenting with data, were trying to turn their inhabitants into innovators, into people able to launch startup companies, for instance. I've also worked with a doctoral student, Félix Talva, who is writing his doctoral dissertation about San Francisco, Medellin, and Paris, and is actually looking at the Paris urban land that I was mentioning earlier. I'm also using a European project coordinating by Sebastian Fortenhauer at the Technical University of Munich about the imperative of scaling things up and scaling up innovation and co-creation in urban settings. And I've been working with Mathieu Baudrin on this project, and particularly about autonomous driving tests, such as the one I was mentioning in Tokyo, and also with Alexandre Viol about hydrogen cars and these other types of experiments. So in these examples are all related to tests and experiments about mobility, energy, about data. So experiments that are conducted in the city, but also experiments that are conducted with the city. Because in all these cases, the city is not just a passive context for these experiments to be organized, but it's also the thing that is executed with, the thing that is tested. It's possible to rethink how the spatial organization of the city is made, for instance, by by optimizing the use of the existing transportation networks instead of planning long-term extension of cities' infrastructure. And that's why we coined the term city experiments to point to this dual dimension, right? These are experiments conducted in the city, but also experiments that are conducted with the city. Of course, we're not the only one talking about experiments in the city. There are many. There is a growing body of literature about the experimental city. But when we use this term, we want to grab together the three dimensions that you can see on this slide. The fact that these experiments are instrumented, that there are socio-technical instruments used to organize them, that they are tied to public demonstrations, and that they have some dimension of uncertainty and some objective connected to learning. Well, when we speak of city experiments, it's also a way not to ask certain questions. I mean, there is a growing body of literature about experiment city, which is interested in whether or not experiments can contribute to global problems, to solving global problems, for instance, energy transition, environmental transition, that sort of thing. There's a growing body of literature that asks questions such as, are experiments really efficient? How do they work? How can they be improved, etc., etc. So I'm not saying that these questions are not interesting. They are certainly interesting, but the questions I'm asking are a bit different. It's connected to understanding experiments as a way of governing the city and simultaneously producing knowledge about it, but also a way of organizing the economy. So that's why it's a perspective that is informed by STS, Science and Technology Studies, that sees the city as a truth spot, to quote Gearing, a city where knowledge is produced, a site where knowledge is produced, a site of co-production, to use a phrase that has become famous in STS. And we do so by looking at actual practices of experimenting, but also investigating how do experiments matter and for whom. And in doing that, we can then look at the joint joint dynamic of knowledge production on one hand and political and economic ordering on the other hand. Well, this probably looks a bit theoretical, but I will get into more telling examples in the remainder of the talk. There are three main arguments that I want to make today. First, I want to resituate this idea of the urban lab into a broader dynamic, that of splintering urbanism, and I explained what I mean by that. And then I ask the question about the experimental subject, who he is, and how can he or she act. And eventually I'll discuss a particular type of laboratories that is becoming, I think, dominant, which is, I think, again, very problematic. A type of laboratories that is associated with a notion that experiments have to be organized permanently. And I'll conclude with some reflections about alternatives. Well, I realize that in this talk, I will be asking questions rather than providing definitive answers, but I think it's important to identify the relevant questions to ask when confronted with this extremely widespread discourse of experiments and urban labs. But let's start with the first point about this broader dynamic about splintering urbanism. Well, I'm using a book with some of you may already know from written by geographers Graham and Marvin. So the title is Splintering Urbanism, and by this expression they mean, and as written on the slide, the parallel and bundling of infrastructure networks and the fragmentation of urban space. They situate this way of organizing, or perhaps not organizing, the city. And so they situate it after as they say, the collapse of the integrated ideal, whereby cities would be centralized. Cities, all the infrastructures of cities would be organized in a centralized manner. There are many examples of splintering urbanism, and in this book, many of them are neatly described. Here is an illustration that I think is telling, and it's it's the idea of splintering is extremely visible in situations like this one, where rich and poor areas of cities are next to each other, but poorly connected. In the splintered city, inequalities of access are materialized. They become visible through the material networks of infrastructure, and material infrastructures result in inequalities. This situation is, of course, unstable, as seen in the example that you can see on the screen. It's a court case in India about rehabilitation plans after people living in informal houses around the water pipeline were forcibly relocated. And of course, this produced contestations, as some benefited and others didn't. It's the consequences that we can identify of the splintered city. Well, in the splintered city, the publics of urban initiatives are diverse. There are local publics, those who are expected to benefit, and those who are excluded. But there are also very important publics outside the city itself. There are global publics. And as ways of illustration, I will just say a few words about a couple of articles that I think are extremely interesting. This one is about Singapore, and it's a very detailed analysis of what the author calls a super rich enclave in Singapore. So it's a zone of the city with particular regulatory exception meant to attract a global public of wealthy elites, people who are imagined to contribute to the wealth of Singapore. So and this is an interesting illustration because it shows that splintering has connections with ideas and practices of a certain kind of public demonstrations. In this example, this is tied to regulatory exceptions meant to attract global elites. So in this case, the global public is a public inhabitants of the city. But in other cases, the global public is also a public of investors, of financial investors. And this is the second examples I wanted to say a few words about. It's an article written by Michael Goldman in India, and how the city of Bangalore, Goldman studies the process whereby Bangalore is turned into a prospective world city, and doing so imply transforming rural spaces into urban real estate. This is connected with speculative mechanisms, and particularly about land, to transform certain parts and components of the city into new, industry-oriented or innovation-oriented or high-end real estate-oriented sections of the city to make it into a world city. So in this case, the idea of exceptions, of spatial and regulatory exception in the city, is tied to initiatives addressed to a global public and investor ready to spend money in the city of Bangalore in the hope of returns of investment in the future. Of course, this idea of splintering the city and addressing these initiatives to publics that are both local and global encounters resistances. I already said a few words about this example in India, which I think illustrates this kind of tensions very neatly, but there are many others. So this is a picture taken in San Francisco, and it was this movement, this activist movement called the Google Bus protests, during which inhabitants of the cities blocked the buses that were used by Google to move people around. I mean, to move employees of Google from downtown San Francisco to Mountain View in the Silicon Valley, where Google has its offices. This can be seen as a very telling illustration of what the splintered city entails, whereby private initiative form of reserved transportation results in higher costs of living in a particular city, and is resisted by local inhabitants being suffering from this evolution. Well, I'm putting global and local in quotes in this slide because when I did with colleagues some work in San Francisco, and when we met the activists, it was actually quite interesting to realize that they're acting at the local level, and they want to promote a vision of the city that is tied to the local concerns of the inhabitants rather than the global concerns of transnational corporations such as Google, for instance. But they're not only local. I mean, they're acting in coordination with many other activist movements in other cities, and they organized demonstrations that are also global in that they are addressed to a global public meant to be concerned about what's happening in San Francisco right now, as well as in other cities. So this movement of organizing demonstrations is shared, right? It's not just about corporations and powerful actors organizing these demonstrations, but we can also start thinking about counter demonstrations starting from resistance movements. At this stage in this presentation, this shows that the idea of the evolution of the city in the direction of splintering implies a series of interventions in the city that produce inequalities, that produce frictions, and that produce various types of demonstration. Well, I think that the current concern for the laboratory is, by many respects, a manifestation of the splintered city. Well, I don't want to say that everything in the splintered city is an experiment, but I want to say that experiments thrive in the splintered city. And not only do they thrive in the splintered city, but they also the experiments also contribute to shaping the splintered city and to perpetuate the dynamics of splintering. It is then, I think, quite important to ask the question of the experimental subject: who experiments in and with the splintered city, and who is left out, and what does it mean to turn particular human subjects into experimental subjects in the splintered city. And we can continue with the example of San Francisco that I was mentioning just a minute ago. Well, in San Francisco is perhaps well, I mean, it's a very interesting example to understand the relationship between splintering the city and organizing experiments in the city. In San Francisco, all sorts of experiments are conducted with transportation prices, for instance, with how to use urban spaces. So inhabitants are encouraged to propose new ways of using urban spaces that are dedicated for them to test things, like, you know, organizing new form of collective projects, collaborative projects, using public space as to set up bars, or to set up charging stations for electric cars or for other types of devices. And you could argue that the resistant movements, such as the Google bus protests, are resistance against experiments. Well, it's more about experiments and counter-experiments, demonstrations and counter-demonstrations. In the resistance movement, the activist movement in San Francisco engaged in protests that I think that can be seen as counter-demonstrations, as I said, but also engage in all sorts of experiments of their own. For instance, they have produced interesting maps of San Francisco, trying to map the evictions in the city, trying to connect the eviction with other dynamics of the city, for instance, the extension of the number of coffee shops, or the trajectory of the Google buses, and how this connect with the eviction. So if you're curious about that, you can check the anti-eviction mapping project, which is quite interesting to understand this, these counter experiments. So this shows that who the experimental subject is contentious. There are initiatives meant to turn the inhabitants into experimental subjects, into people able to test things in the urban space, but not everybody is happy about that. And there are other propositions to imagine what the experimental subjects should do and how. But in all the cases, experiments appear as a way of governing the splintered city. Experiments appear as a way of governing the splintered city through innovation, by designing certain spaces, by acting on urban space, by doing new things. Well, this is an example from Singapore that I like, because it really illustrates how experiments are used to govern the splintered city. So it's about transportation, it's about tests of, as you can see on the slide, mobility concepts. It's this picture was produced by the Land Transport Authority of Singapore, and it was presented to colleagues of mine and myself when we did some fieldwork in Singapore a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, and all that people were explaining, everything people were explaining to us was that Singapore was designing particular spaces to test various technologies. They use regularly the term sandbox. And it's interesting because they talked about regulatory sandbox, not only for transportation, as you can see on the slide, but also for energy, for health, and for finance. It's actually the very idea of regulatory sandbox comes from finance. And it's the idea that sections of the city are to be transformed into special zones, into zones of exceptions, into zones where regulatory constraints do not all apply, for innovation to be able to be tested, and for regulation itself to be able to be tested. In Singapore, there is decided that there is a reinvention of political sovereignty as the ability to carve out exceptions within the geographical and regulatory landscape of the state. So the state, the objective of political power would be less to constrain and more about carving out exceptions in the existing spatial and regulatory space of the city. Again, this goes with particular imaginations of who the experimental subject should be. As in San Francisco, there is decided in Singapore that you need to turn inhabitants into active experimental subjects. Well, for years, Singapore has imagined itself as a lab for global corporations to test their technologies, to test medical innovation, for instance, or to test energy innovation. And the government of Singapore has been quite explicit about that. They would say things like, in Singapore, you have world-class infrastructures, and you have a tech-savvy population who will be ready to use new technologies. So it's the ideal place for you, global corporations, to test your technology. But in recent years, the discourse has also shifted. The population of Singapore is not only expected to be some kind of guinea pigs for global corporation to test their technologies, but the inhabitants of Singapore are also expected to be active experimenters, expected to test new technologies and expected to make money out of it, expected to create companies out of this initiative. And I like this illustration because it shows that the experimental subject is supposed to be everybody, right? Even old people are to be turned into digital creators, as you can see on this slide. This is something I took from an official website of one of Singapore's public agencies about information and communication technologies. It's not just it's not something that comes from a private initiative. It's from the government of Singapore, and it's the idea that Singapore needs to turn everyone, including old people, into creators, into people able to engage in new things. Well, all people, it's not entirely true, because these active experimental subjects are all citizens in Singapore. And of course, not everyone is a citizen in Singapore. In Singapore, 40% of the population is made of transient workers who do not hold citizenship, who have a limited number of rights in the city. And these transient workers, so to speak, are almost the part of the infrastructure of the lab. There are those whose work ensure that maintenance costs are very low. They are there to ensure that sensors can be changed regularly. They are there to ensure that the infrastructures are properly run. And of course, they are not part of this initiative. They're not expected to be active experimental subjects. So this shows that even in situations such as Singapore, when there is no visible controversies and protests like in San Francisco, even in these situations, turning human subjects into experimenters is not neutral. It goes with a particular vision of what political ordering should be, of what the role of the state should be, and what the role of the citizen is. Well, the last illustration I wanted to say a few words about, to reflect on this idea of the experimental subject, is maybe to come back to this idea, to the reference to data that is prominent in contemporary reflections about experiments and urban labs. And we're getting more and more illustration of data that take this form. This is a picture I took from a report written by Huawei 2 years ago, and this is an illustration of Shenzhen's, Chinese city, Shenzhen's city brain. And so you have this big screen, this idea that you have sensors everywhere in the city. You can track everything that's going on in the city. You can centralize and control through data and optimization. Well, by many respects, this use of data, this very objective of constructing a city brain, can be seen as a way to re-centralize the splintered city. Well, I want to say that it's only partly true, because of course you're re-centralizing, but here, as in other examples, using data is a way to maintain the diversity of the splintered city, and just adding another layer of complexity, adding another layer of control and tracking. In this case, as in the previous one, experiments are ways to govern the splintered city, because a city brain such as this one also allows the people who control it to conduct various kinds of experiments, for instance, by changing the prices of transportation systems, and see how people react, and seeing in real time what the consequences of particular price mechanisms can be. And this again asks the question of who the experimental subject is. Are we giving particular possibilities for control for those who design those experiments, whereby turning other people into guinea pigs, just reacting to what parameters are defined by those who control the experiment. So this reflection about the experimental subjects, I think, should lead us to reflect on the kind of spaces where city experiments are conducted, and the kind of human subjects that are involved. Where are experimental subjects active or passive? Who are they, and who is excluded? What about the external publics, those who are expected to witness the quality of the experiments for future investments, or are expected who wants to control what's going on, for instance, such as the example I just said about the city brands. And when we ask those questions, we see that who benefits from these initiatives is not consensual. There are people who gain much more leverage than others. There are people who are expected to be involved, and others who are excluded. Well, as I said, these are more questions than definitive answers. I'm more interested in pointing to the questions we should raise when looking at urban laboratories. But I still want to conclude with a few words about a certain type of laboratory that is becoming increasingly present, perhaps dominant today. And I want to finish by opening up our reflection about potential alternatives. And again, I won't give you a definitive answer, but at least I want to suggest some direction of thinking for transforming how urban laboratory can be imagined and actually organized. Well, to do so, I'll use the example of autonomous driving, which is telling by many respects. And I'm using a work that is conducted with my colleague Mathieu Baudrin, who has been doing very interesting work about the type of experiments that are organized about autonomous driving and the frictions, the tensions that they produce between experimenters, companies, particularly the companies who sell the possibility for experiments and tests, and the needs and concerns of the territories and cities where those experiments are expected to be organized and where they are actually organized. So I don't know if you've seen that sort of autonomous vehicle. It's an automatic shuttle that has been experimented in various places in the world. For those of you who live in Paris, you may have seen it in Vincennes, in the east of Paris, close to the park, and it's autonomous. It's entirely experimental. It goes very, very slowly. Actually, if you walk past, if you walk, you can very easily pass it because it's a test and it's being tested right now. It's being this case is interesting because it's also a case where companies sell experimental devices for testing shuttles. I mean, companies sell those shuttles entirely for testing objectives. And the company who sell those shuttles have shareholders who are global corporations who sell automotive, and these corporations are manufacturing companies that produce automotive parts or sensors, for instance. So for those shareholders, the tests are quite important. There are ways of experimenting with these automotive parts. There are ways of experimenting with those sensors, and that's why the company they invest in is interesting. For the company selling those automotive cars, they're selling the test itself, they're selling the possibility to experiment, and they're selling the promise of replication and extension. They're selling the possibility for replicating this in the future elsewhere, or they're selling the possibility to extend the number of kilometers that the shuttle will travel. Framed as this, it's very easy to locate the tension between what experimenters do and what local territories want, or what local territories expect from the experiments. I'm not sure, I don't think all of you in the audience read French, but this example is interesting. This is a very rural area in the center of France who is promoting on its website the fact that it will be an experimental site for autonomous vehicle. And it says that autonomous vehicle will help opening up the territory, will help connecting it to the outside world, will help constructing transportation structures for mobility across the territory, help all people who can't, etc., etc. Well, of course, the expectations of this territory are in tensions with others' expectations. There are tensions with expectations that consist in seeing the tests as a local punctual event for future replication elsewhere. That they are in tension with a way of seeing the tests as, testing car components independently from local transportation needs. This tension is visible elsewhere. It's not reserved to autonomous driving. When I used the example of Singapore earlier, I could go back to this example and see the same tension between the idea of turning the island into a nation of guinea pigs for companies to test their products for replication elsewhere in the world, and the local needs of the population. And I think this reflection can lead us to identify a particular situation, a situation that what I labeled economies of permanent experiments, a situation whereby the mode of imagining political action is about redefining sovereignty as the ability to carve out exceptions, spatial and regulatory exceptions, a particular way of defining economic value in the terms of promises. Promises for investors, promises of investors that would gain money in the future thanks to the replication of the experiment, thanks to the knowledge that is gained from the test, and of course promises for investors that can be in tensions with promises for local inhabitants. In this economy of permanent experiments, there are frictions between global flows and local expectations, and of course a very pressing question about the long-term development of territories in situations of geographic and temporal fragmentation. The last question that it will be, and I will with these consideration, is about, is this simple question: what is the lab? What is the laboratory of the economy of permanent experiments? And this laboratory functions on a particular type of promise, on a promise of future replication, a promise of extension, a promise of money easily gained, a promise of future value deriving from the extension of what is being tested. And it's easier to frame the promise in those terms when you have isolated technical solutions that are easily defined, that are easily tested, that are easily controlled, that can be described in a limited set of parameters, that are easily framed in a well-bounded space, where you can define a perimeter of exception in the spatial and regulatory term. This lab of permanent experiments is really can really be associated with the imperative of scaling things up, and these are just illustrations of this this new imperative of replication and scale up that we can find everywhere from the discourse of smart city to the discourse of urban lives. It's always a promise. It's always expecting somewhere that will come in the future. It's always a promise of seeing something elsewhere in other places after it has been tested in a particular city. It works well with a solutionist approach whereby complex global problems can be solved using local technical solutions described by a limited number of parameters, and it thrives with the regulatory and spatial exceptions in the dual sense that they are exceptional and exemptions from regular constraints. So the laboratory of the economy of permanent experiments is made of technical solutions. It thrives on exceptions. It rests on promises of external extensions. So it's a simple lab. It's a lab that is mostly technical. It's a well-bounded lab. It's a lab that has a clearly defined clearly defined perimeters in spatial or regulatory terms, and it's also a temporal lab. It's a lab that is that works with the promise of future extension. So it's not a lab that is expected to be connected to what's happening on the ground on the long term. Well, is it possible to think about alternatives? Is it possible to think about richer laboratories which would be addressed to diverse publics, including local ones? Is it possible to think about labs that will function not just on promises, but on actual interventions benefiting people living in the city? Is it possible to think of a lab that will not only be a simplistic version of a isolated solution, but which would account for the complexity of urban life? Well, I don't have a definite answer, but I think it's important to conclude on some perspectives for alternatives, for other kinds of urban lives. And I think transportation, again, provides interesting example because, as I said, there is this imperative of scaling technologies up and replicating technologies. There is this example of the autonomous vehicle that I just mentioned. But there is also another way to think about the scaling imperative. You can contrast replication and extension with the idea of making things more dense in a given territory, not just replicating things outside the city, but adding things inside the city. This reflection come from a project I'm running right now with another colleague, with Alexandre Viol, and we're looking at hydrogen cars and experiments with hydrogen cars. And in a series of projects, the idea is to extend things, but not outside the territory, within the territory. For instance, by using charging stations with other stuffs than just hydrogen cars. For instance, by complementing particular hydrogen car technology tested in a given territory with other mobility services. So we're speaking of deep scaling, which is, in our view, a way to contrast replication and extension in the world of permanent experiments with something else, with something that would account from the complexity of local life. And I want to finish with this, with maybe going back to the expression living lab that has been widespread to account for certain kind of urban laboratory, and trying to take this living dimension seriously. What would it mean to have a living lab that is actually alive, where the promise of the future is not just about scaling up externally, but scaling deeply, making it more dense, taking into account the diversity, the complexity, the richness of urban life. This would imply looking at reframing the kind of research that is being done in the lab, something that would be more messy, for sure, that will be akin to what Calon called the wild, that is able to take into account what's happening with counter-experimenters. So, for instance, protesters, as in San Francisco. This will be messy. This will be more complicated to use to please investors eager to be convinced that there will be economic profit in the future at a large scale. But it will be, I think, important not to have dead labs, because when we look again at examples such as past Olympic cities, these are examples of dead labs. Experiments that have been conducted once for the sake of a global public, not for the sake of a local population. And I think it's extremely important today to think about the urban lab as a living space in all the sense of the terms, not just a temporary space of exception for the sake of global publics. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brice Laurent, for this presentation. It was very dense and very interesting. So I will let the public to ask questions if they have. If not, I will perhaps start by my question, because I have a few questions, and after some people will have the possibility to talk. So I have a first question about the question of about the inequalities. You show the case of the Brain region in the center of France, and the question of the spatialization of data with Huawei. it is possible to see in the question of experimentation a sort of inequality concerning the deployment of a network, of the good network like the 5G. So perhaps we know that there is inequalities in the territory about the access to the network, but it has an influence of the deployment of experimentation in the territory, or it is not really connected, and a territory without a good network have other kind of experiments?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can find inequalities everywhere. If you look at the deployment of instructors, of course, there will be questions of who has access to the network and who doesn't. There will be questions like this all the time. The type of inequalities that I was mentioning are perhaps a bit different because they are really related to who is involved in the experiment, who benefit from it, and who is the experimental subject, and what does it mean to turn certain people into experimental subjects, and for I mean, it's a particular way of looking at inequalities in the urban environment, and it's not exactly the same thing. I would say that the problem of inequality of access to certain infrastructures, although the two are certainly connected because the extension of certain kind of networks function through experiments.
Thank you. I will have another question. You spoke about the regulation and the regulators as an important stakeholder for control the experiments. And you speak in the same time for the Indian case about the justice, the court. Do the courts have a specific role in terms of accepting or not the experimentation? In the case of India, we saw that the courts have a kind of influence on local authorities, but in the case of San Francisco, do the courts have an influence of on the experiments made in the city or in the region?
Well, it's a general point, and it's a very important question because in all these situations there is a very important legal dimension to experiments. I mean, you don't turn particular parts of the city into experimental space without some sort of legal grounds. In France, for instance, there have been constitutional changes allowing local communities, local collectivités in French, to experiment, to do things that are outside the outside legal norms, and this has required constitutional changes. In all these contexts, there is an important legal dimension, either beforehand, to provide political bodies with the legal possibility to carve out exemptions in particular conditions, or afterwards, when people contest what has been done. In the example of the super rich enclave in Singapore, it's the article which was written by Mr. Poe. Well, is the material for this article mostly comes from a court case where people exemption that had been granted to the company that constructed this site in San Francisco. The activists use legal challenges to contest what's going on in the city, and this has been discussed in the legal setting. So it would be, I think, an empirical site in its own right to look at how the the making of the laboratory is actually formed and for what for consequences, including in the legal theory of the countries at stake. Yeah, of course. So yes. I'm reading the question that was asked on the chat. Of course, there are very different contexts, and I think and we can say very interesting things about, for instance, the particularity of the case of Singapore. Singapore, a city-state that has constructed itself, that has defined itself as a laboratory since its independence, and you could even argue that the idea of the lab has been for the country to act as a sovereign power, and this was, I mean, very early in the history of Singapore. The government was calling global corporations to come and test their technologies on the island. And they were very keen on turning the island into a space suitable for those tests. And the contemporary evolution with the idea of turning are interesting developments of this imagination of the city-state as a global lab. Of course, in France, it's completely different in the sense that it's a more recent evolution that is constitutional, as I said, which makes the role of the state extremely problematic. So we can say various things about what this difference tells us about the various political contexts, and I think it would be extremely interesting to do so. That said, I think there are some analytical questions that are relevant in all those contexts. For instance, asking about the experimental subjects, asking about how exemptions and exceptions are carved out, asking about how to carve out exemptions relates to the transfer of sovereignty is relevant in all these contexts. And in all these contexts, I think it's important to identify this imperative for permanent experimentation, this and this association between expectations of future replication, anticipation of future value, future financial value, and solutionist approaches whereby global problems should have localized technical solutions that are ready to test. Can be identified in many different contexts, and I think it's important to to characterize this mode of acting.
Hi everybody, I'm Mathieu Baudrin, a colleague of Brice Laurent. I have one question for you, Brice. Actually, two related questions. You highlight the fact that there is two kind of dynamics with between deep scalings and scaling up, and I was wondering if along your many empirical travel you did in Singapore, San Francisco, and also the investigation we did in Europe, could you tell us more about if the companies or the local political authorities did identify specific things that prevent the scaling up of the experiments? Did they are able to identify what's make it impossible or difficult in any ways? And the second question, which is related to that, would you say that the deep scalings could be seen as a strategy to overcome the difficulties to scale up the things?
Thanks, Mathieu. Yeah, of course, there are many difficulties for scaling things up that are identified, but I would say that we should not take these difficulties as identified by companies for granted. because they're part of a particular problematization of innovation diffusion. So, for instance, there is a discourse about legal constraints and regulations being obstacles to the extension and diffusion and replication of innovation. This is a particular understanding of the relationship between innovation and regulation. It goes particularly well with the idea of permanent experimentations, because it will lead you to carve out additional exemptions, to carve out new special places where innovation is expected to thrive. But it's not the only way of thinking about innovation. You could think of innovation as completely associated with regulatory developments. You can think about innovation as accounting for the various concerns of a series of actors who need additional protection from regulatory intervention. So these difficulties for scaling things up, as identified by global actors, are part of the economy of permanent experiments, I'd say. As such, it's important to be able to displace them, I think. This is a bit connected with the question I'm reading on the chat about evaluation, because evaluation is certainly important. It's certainly an important part of experiments. And actually, when I presented the components of city experiments, the last one was about uncertainty and learning, and there is no learning without evaluation. So there is evaluation everywhere. But again, the way of doing evaluation is part of what should be analyzed, I would say. In the regime of permanent experiment, evaluation is done in a very particular way. It's done with the objective of replication and scaling things up in mind, meaning that evaluation will work very neatly with a limited number of measurable parameters, mostly technicals. Evaluations will require numbers. Evaluation will require quantitative assessments of potential of extension elsewhere. And evaluation will tend to simplify the complexity of the local site where the experiment is conducted. So if you want, and for instance, in the example I was giving about autonomous shuttles in France, you could evaluate the experiment by measuring the numbers of kilometers that the shuttle has traveled. You could evaluate the experiment by looking at the technical parts of the shuttle and seeing if the sensors, for instance, have worked well. And if so, you could say that this case was very interesting because the zone was very large. So the shuttles traveled a high number, large distances. And we know that sensors are useful for various kinds of situations. And then we know that the shuttle can be used elsewhere in various places. But if the evaluation is done from the viewpoint of the territory itself, then it might not be as positive, because if it will say that, oh yeah, we've used this shuttle for 6 months and we've traveled 5,000 kilometers, but maybe just 3 people were in there. And maybe nobody's life was significantly improved by this shuttle. So evaluation is always there, but it's part of what is contested. And it's the same, it connects to Matthew's question about the difficulties of scaling things up. How you measure and how you evaluate those difficulties is connected to how you frame the objective of the experiment in the first part. Yeah, and that's Matthew's second question was about deep scaling, and I completely agree with you. If we take this idea of deep scaling seriously, then we rethink the way we frame innovation policies at both the practice and objective levels. It's about resituating innovation policies, and again, it's messy and it's more complicated to organize. It's more complicated to make the economic value explicit. But at the end of the day, it's a way of making the urban land richer, not to have dead labs, as I was saying.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just Alexander, if you allow me, I just wanted to respond to the comment about the mismatch between the autonomous car and the rural context. Well, you're right. On a certain level, you're absolutely right. But then we should be cautious about saying things like that, because from the viewpoint of the company testing those shuttles, there is no real differences between the rural context and the urban one. These are all experimental sites for the shuttles to for the company to test the shuttle, for the shuttle to travel or ever larger distances, for the shuttle to be used as a platform to test new technologies. So if we take the extreme vision of this process, as all these sites are only laboratories, then there is no such thing as a problematic situations of use. It's just a matter of having the shuttle traveling an ever larger distances.
Thank you. I would like to finish by a last question to introduce the next session. This webinar will take place all the second Wednesday of the month, and the next session should be the 13th of January. And Mathieu Baudrin will present the question of the autonomous driving during this session with a study case. So my question is about the mobility. So why do you think the mobilities is nowadays the most important topic about urban experiments? It is only because it's the most visible, or it's because technologically it's one of the more important?
Well, I'm not sure.
Yes.
I'm not sure it's the most. I'm not sure it's the most important domain in urban experiments, because you could argue that energy, for instance, is very important. You could argue that data and how to use them is also a very important domain in urban experiments. But I would say that transportation is very useful for us to understand what experimenting entails, and for us to understand the tension between the promise of replication and extension and the contribution to local needs. In the case of transportation, it's extremely useful to see the tension between testing a technology and replicating it elsewhere. If you test transportation technology in a given city with the promise of replicating elsewhere, it's very easy to see a tension between anchoring that technology in a city and extracting it from the city to make it to use it elsewhere. It's very easy to see the tension between the expectation of global actors circulating technologies everywhere in the world and local inhabitants expecting transportation systems to answer their everyday needs. So it's more a matter. It's almost more a methodological / analytical means for me to identify the important tensions to take into account with urban experiments, rather than the main domain, strictly speaking, where experiments are conducted today.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. And if we can use a case, a specific case, I think about Tokyo Olympics 2020. They implement a charging station for hydrogen vehicles, but at the same time, the charging station is always used for the buildings, for the energy of the buildings built for the Olympic Village, and it is totally connected between the two experiments. In the same time, the energy for the buildings and the cars and other public vehicles like the bus hydrogen bus. So it's evident that there is always connected. But what I wanted to say, it's perhaps it's more visible for citizens to see the experiments in terms of mobilities, because it's what we see in the street, and sometimes experimentation in buildings are more hidden to the normal regards. I can say it's why it's not more important perhaps in terms of evidently in terms of economy, but it's very important in terms of visibility.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. If there is no other question, I think we can stop here and we can restart in 1 month with Mathieu Baudrin.
Okay.
So
thank you all. Thank you, Alexandre, for organizing this.
Thank you, and have a good end of the year, and see you everyone in the 13th of January. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandre.